Well, good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and jump back into our introduction to the prophets. Last week, I intended to do an introduction to Ezekiel. Unfortunately, I only got about halfway through the introduction. Maybe a little bit more, but this will give us an opportunity to slow down a little bit. I broke it into two sections, so we will cover the rest of it this evening. If you recall, let's see, Ezekiel is a prophet that's around what event? Okay, the Babylonian captivity. Where is Ezekiel? Where does he do his prophetic work? In Babylon, yeah. Yeah, he's part of the exiles. He went to Babylon with the exiles on which wave of the captivity? Second wave, right? Who went in the first wave? Daniel. And then Ezekiel in the second wave. And who never went away at all? Jeremiah. And so again, we see that God has placed his prophets, one with the king over Israel. And who's that king? Nebuchadnezzar, right? So initially, and then through other kings, successive kings as well. And then he's placed a prophet with the people in Babylon, and he's kept a prophet with the people in Israel. So this would put his prophecy, if you begin the second wave of deportation, what year would that be? All right, approximately 597. And then we have prophecies that run out to, let's see. Give me a second. I'm going to double check my numbers here. That run out to about 570 is the last dated prophecy, which was one that was given to Egypt. All right, so Ezekiel's a priest. Somebody who was well respected by the people. We talked about his the outline, the day of the Lord for Israel, the day of the Lord for everyone, and then the restoration in the last section there. And then as we were talking about types of communication, we actually discussed all of these. But I want to just reiterate some of the information that we find here. As far as oral communication is concerned, this is just standard, go say to the people, this is what the Lord says. And you see plenty of that. But he also has visions. How does Ezekiel begin? With the vision of... All right, God's chariot. From the very beginning, the wheels that are there, the creatures, the throne of God being above the wheels. So all of that, you have the chariot and all of that discussion, that is a vision. You see another chariot vision, chapters 8 through 10, and that is with God leaving the temple at that point. And then another really important vision, chapters 40 through 48. What is that vision? At the end? What's that? Yeah, it's the new temple and God coming back to reside once again with his people in the new temple. Another vision, one that we will talk about, I think, in just a little bit, which is one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known vision from Ezekiel, is what vision? All right, the valley of the dry bones in chapter 37. All right, so again, we have all of these symbolic actions. And I said I was going to bring my book, and I just now realized my book is still sitting on the desk at my house and is not here with me. So, So the Bullock book, it is just, I think it's just simply called an introduction to the Old Testament prophets, or prophetic books or prophetical books. Can't remember which terminology he uses. But anyway, all of these I just pulled straight from Bullock's book. He's the one that put all of this together. And these are various things that Ezekiel has to do. And his action is supposed to represent something for the people of Israel. All right, so we talked about those last week. And then I think the last thing that we really talked about, prophetic discourse. And the difference, what's the difference between prophetic discourse and oral communication? What's that, Jan? It's long. These are long moments of teaching. This would be like in, say, Matthew, when in the sections of Matthew that are called the discourses, it's the sections where long bit of teaching in these sections. It's more than just a coming to them with a thus saith the Lord. So it's instruction, either speaking of God's view of Israel or discussion of allegories and such things. All right. So we briefly mentioned, and this is, I think, where I realized I was running out of time and thought, let's just kind of cut it here. Some key themes of Ezekiel. The first one that I would bring out, a key theme of this prophet, is God's justice. All right, let's talk about God's justice. And by the way, this is going to be intricately tied to the next one as well. And so we're going to maybe even talk about both of these at the same time to some degree. But what do we see about God's justice in Ezekiel? If you were to take a guess. Yeah, John? Okay, hold on one second. Let's let Ryan get up here. All right, go for it.
Very good at showing his tender mercy and grace towards Israel. And he promises if they obey his commands that he will be there for them. But because he is a just God, he will turn to the other side of his personality, where he will punish them or rebuke them or chastise them or discipline them, however you want to look at it. And in that way, he cannot lie, because he told through the promises he gave Israel in the first place, if you do what I ask you to do, then I'll be with you forever. But if you won't, the troubles and the plagues that are upon other nations will come upon you.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. And I think that we're going to save the first part of your statement for a little bit. That is the gracious aspect. And so we will definitely talk about that. But especially, I'm going to throw this at you ladies who just spent a little bit of time talking about Exodus chapter 34. Not only in Exodus 34 does God describe himself as being compassionate and full of mercy, slow to anger, full of loving kindness, but what else does he say about himself? Okay, Lorraine says he will visit the iniquities. Y'all remember that part? Did y'all talk about that part? What does that mean? He will visit the iniquities. Say that again. Okay, recompense for the sin. All right. Very good. It's a word we don't use very often. It's the right word. I'm not saying that's wrong, but what does that mean? What is in Exodus 34? Guys, you can join in too. I know I said for the ladies, but you're allowed to as well. What does that mean? Yeah, Sue?
It says that he would visit the sins to the third and fourth generation, but he was his loving kindness to ten thousands.
Okay.
So it's his kindness is more than his
Okay.
punishment.
I don't want to talk about the chesed at the moment, that loving kindness that goes to the tens of thousands, right? Right? Because that's what we focus on, isn't it? I mean that, and by the way, who else focuses on that? God does, right? I mean that's his point. And so I'm not trying to take away from what Sue said, because Sue is 100% absolutely right. That is the juxtaposition that we are supposed to see. We're supposed to compare God's loving kindness, loyalty, covenant loyalty, love. There's a reason, and I probably shouldn't have just thrown the Hebrew word out just a few minutes ago. There's a reason for that, though, is we don't have a good translation for that word. There's all kinds of things for it. The ways, different translations will use it in different ways. And it's kind of like this big lump of just God's awesome goodness and his focus on his covenant and being loyal to his people and his promises. But that's hard to put in just one word. And so yeah, that's what Sue's talking about. That lasts for the thousands of generations, right? Compared to visiting his iniquity upon his people, on those who sin, he says he does not just simply erase the sin. He visits that iniquity even up to the third and the fourth generation. That's what I really want to focus on right here, because, yes, Sue, you're absolutely right. The comparison is, over here, Kelly, the comparison is the third, the fourth generation to the thousands of generations. But let's focus on that third and fourth generation aspect. Go ahead, Kelly.
Recompense is getting your comeuppance. It's getting what you've got coming to you.
Yep.
And a lot of the times, the lessons that we learned best came with some pain.
Okay. So it's getting what's coming. Did you say some of the lessons we learned best come with pain? Is that the phrase? Yeah. And there's definitely something to that. Look at chapter 18. Chapter 18, and this this is going to be a part of this discussion, a part of the discussion of the next one too, to some degree. How many of y'all are familiar with verse 4? Ezekiel 18, verse 4. Heard this one before? Yeah. We usually use this passage in what context? Original sin. We say, look, right here. You who believe in original sin, right there. Who is it going to pay the punishment? The one who sins. Case closed. I've got Ezekiel chapter 18. This has nothing to do with the discussion of original sin. He's not discussing that. That's not in the context. It's not near the context. This isn't tangential to that context. This has nothing to do with Adam. This has nothing to do with the sinfulness of one person moving to the next, moving to the next, moving to the next. You can have that conversation, but Ezekiel 18 is not a part of it. This has nothing, he's not in any way, shape, or form trying to address the concept of original sin, and it doesn't even tangentially work. What is under discussion here? What's the proverb that's been going around? Yes, Serena? Mike's coming.
That's Ryan, it's not Mike.
No, thank you. Yes.
If I'm reading your mind correctly,
Oh, boy, that's a scary thought.
it's not the idea of the sin going to the third and the fourth generation. It's not the sin necessarily, but the consequences of the sin.
Okay.
Like when they, when the when when the when they spent 40 years in the wilderness, the children who were not necessarily part of the spies who didn't believe, but the children who were born during that time suffered the consequences of the fathers,
Mm-hmm.
even though they did not commit that sin.
Yes.
So it's not the original sin, but it is the consequences of that sin. And even today, when in our families, the children may not have sinned, but they may suffer the consequences of the parents' sin just because of the challenges the parents face. And then their children might also suffer consequences of that because the children who grew up with the consequences of the father's sin might still have have issues because of it. It's that kind of concept, if I'm reading your mind correctly.
If we were discussing Exodus chapter 34 very specifically, I would be like, Serena, you just totally nailed that completely, and we can just move on in our discussion, because I think what you just said is absolutely right as far as what it means when he says, I will visit the iniquity upon the third, the fourth generation, and they will suffer those consequences even to the third and the fourth generation. That is, you said that very, very well. Now, in Ezekiel, though, I think we're seeing a nuance of this whole idea in that these children are complaining, and I say children, they're adults. This isn't, the little kids going around saying this. These are adults who are saying what proverb from verse 2? Yeah, the fathers eat the sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. What does that mean? What's that? I don't know. Okay. Okay, but it's an assumption. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Sour grapes will put teeth on edge. But what are they complaining? What are they saying? Okay, they're saying, Julia just said, they're suffering the consequences of who ate the sour grapes? Not us. We're not the ones who found the sour grapes in the wilderness and decided to try to eat them. They got to enjoy good grapes. They're sour, and we're the ones who are experiencing what they did. That's the proverb. Why are we in Babylon? That's their question. And why do they believe they're in Babylon? Because they're in captivity. That's absolutely right, Joshua. But why do they believe that they were taken into captivity? Because their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to lose track of how many greats I've given. But just keep going. Has there not been generation upon generation upon generation of people who have left the covenant that they had devoted themselves to? And God finally, his patience, hits its stopping point. He sends them into captivity, and they say, great! We're stuck going through this because our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were a bunch of nincompoops and did all kinds of stuff, right? It's not our fault. Is that accurate? Yeah, Kelly? Okay, hold on. Sounds like you've got a little bit more than just a two-word, and there's no way I'll be able to remember it all to respond. Go for it.
They're right that it wasn't their sins that landed them there, but they're still sinners. They still deserve God's justice for what they're doing in their lives. They're blame casting, and they're not owning their own problems. Like maybe Daniel could say that. Maybe. of the captives, but your average everyday guy walking around Babylon as a Jew still had some problems going on. They're trying to say, this isn't, I don't deserve any of this. Well, yeah, you deserve some of this. It might be worse, but you get what you deserve. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Keep in mind that how far are we removed from the waves of captivity? Okay? Not very far, right? I mean, this all has taken place in their recent history. Remember Habakkuk? Remember talking about Habakkuk? How long must I call for help? Cry out to you about violence? Why do you look at injustice and tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right here in front of me. Strife is ongoing. Conflict escalates. The law is not effective. Justice doesn't emerge. The wicked restrict righteous. Justice is perverted. How long ago was that Habakkuk writes this? 2, 3, 4 generations ago? These guys are still alive. All right? A lot of these people, some of them obviously probably have passed. We're only, 20, 30 maybe years removed? Right? These are the people who are in captivity right now. You look at some of the other prophets. Jeremiah, don't cry out, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord. Just do what you're supposed to do, right? If you would turn and treat your neighbor right and show love to your neighbor and do the things that you should do to help each other, then all of this, could be avoided. But you don't, and you won't, in your own arrogance. Whose fault is it that they went into captivity? Who said that? That was over here. Eliza? That's absolutely right. The people he's writing to are the very people whose wickedness brought them into captivity. And they're trying to say, well, this is Manasseh's fault, or Ammon's fault before me, or this is Ahab's, from the north, and all of the stuff that they did. And this is years upon years of compounding anger on God's part. And what's Ezekiel's point? Whose fault is it? It's your fault. He goes, you can't claim it's their fault and point fingers somewhere else. You are the reason you're in captivity. God hasn't done this to you. Now, maybe a generation or two down the road from here, maybe they might have some type of a claim. But at that point, we go to what Serena was talking about before. And this goes into that discussion that says, yeah, the consequences of the actions are going to go for how many generations? To the third or the fourth generation. And that might last about how many years? Around 70 years maybe? And once we've maxed out the third or the fourth generation, at that point, what does God perhaps, what might he do? Let them go back. Right? Yeah, I think you're seeing this to the third, the fourth generation plays out here the same way I think it plays out in the wilderness with the 40 years that they wander in the wilderness. And you see some of the same thing. But Ezekiel chapter 18, this is not an indictment on original sin. This isn't a part of that discussion. This is God, through Ezekiel, saying, shut up. Quit blaming other people for what you've done. Man up and take responsibility for your own actions. You are the reason you are here. Now, was it on your parents too? Absolutely. But it's also you. You are the reason that you are in captivity. That's what Ezekiel's coming to. And this is all about God's justice. By the way, how long has God been putting up with this kind of injustice? For a while, is that what someone said? Yeah, for a pretty long time, right? We didn't talk about this when we were in Jeremiah, but in Jeremiah, he's the one that said they were going to be in captivity for how many years? 70 years. And if you go back and you look in the law, and I don't have the things here written down to go back, and I have an idea of where it is in my head, but I'm not going to say it because I'm almost positive it's wrong. But do you remember what God said he was going to do for the land? He's going to remove the people out of the land so that the land can what? Enjoy its Sabbaths. What's he talking about? Sabbaths. All right. Yeah, Josie just said every 7 years the land was supposed to enjoy a year of rest. So, every 7 years they were supposed to have given the land a Sabbath, and he says, and when you fail to do that, I'm going to let the land enjoy the Sabbaths you didn't give it. So about how long then, approximately, have they been refusing to give the land its Sabbaths? No, little. I mean, if you just, I think doing the math misses the point to some degree, but I think it's important to kind of look at it. 490 years, approximately 577s or 70 times 7 times, right? That they have failed to do what they're supposed to do. And so God is patient with them for that 70 times, 7 times, that he continues to provide forgiveness to them until finally he says, all right, the land's going to enjoy its Sabbath. So that's around 500 years or so. Yeah, Kelly?
Is that why Jesus came up with that number for, was it Peter? Is that where that came from? Is that why that means, would that have meant something to them then?
Yeah. Was I a little too on point with that? Yes. I believe that is.
Huh.
I believe that is the connection that's made when Jesus tells Peter not up to 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Because that is exactly the kind of forgiveness that God had demonstrated towards Israel. And again, it's not a matter of counting the numbers and ticking and checking it off, but it's this fullness of forgiveness that says, hey, this is what I'm granting. And by the way, I think part of that point is if you're able to exhaust the forgiveness of God, then you can do something about it. But the whole point of that story is we're not able to exhaust the forgiveness of God, right? That's why he goes into the story about the man who's forgiven this insurmountable debt, and then he has a debt of about $30,000 or so that he can't let go of. And that's the whole point, is we will never be on that level of forgiveness. So, anyway, that's another discussion, another thing. I guess I was too pointed in the way that I was setting that one up. But yeah, I think that's what's going on here. God's forgiveness is incredible, but God's justice is real. He does visit iniquity on the sinners. They are in captivity, and it's all throughout Ezekiel. They are in captivity very specifically because they have sinned, and they have left that covenant. They've rejected it. And they're suffering because they are just like their fathers, and this is what they have done. All right, the next theme I think that you find is the idea of covenant loyalty. As far as justice is concerned, what does God do? He gets in his chariot and what? Yeah. That's right. That's exactly right, Joshua. Yeah, he gets in his chariot and he leaves the temple. Okay, so yeah, and he's like, adios, right? See you guys. You guys have made yourselves unholy in such a way that I am leaving. I'm taking my presence away from the temple. And because he does so, what happens to that temple? It gets destroyed. I mean, that is the big news in Ezekiel. Remember, that's the moment when his wife dies, and he says, you're not allowed to mourn because you're supposed to show the people when this great thing happens, they're not allowed to mourn because they're the ones who brought this on themselves. And then when the news of the temple comes, what lifts at that point for Ezekiel? What's that? Well, but he was mute and bound. His tongue was bound as far as being able to give the people warnings and help them out in various ways. And God says, no, you're not going to do it. Once that news comes, that lifts from him because there's nothing really to warn anymore. So God is just, and he brings punishment, but this is what Sue brought out earlier. Now, Sue, it's time for your great revelation. God may hold them accountable for the 2 or 3 generations, but what else? Do you remember what you said?
He shows his righteousness to the 10,000s.
Yeah. You have that 2nd or 3rd generation, or the 3rd or 4th generation over here, compared to the thousands of generations over here that he remains loyal to. He remains faithful to. He gives that covenant loyalty. He says, yeah, I may have 2 or 3 or 4 generations that it seems like I'm gone, but I'm not gone. I will be back. And he does. And that's the picture that you have at the end of Ezekiel. He promises that he's going to return in an even greater way. The Valley of Dry Bones is this very kind of a picture, that he's going to bring them from their current dead position. All right, questions or comments concerning these key themes? Yeah, Joshua? Well, the bringing back of dead people that he's referring to in the Valley of the Dry Bones is a picture. It's supposed to be like a vision, a mental picture that we have of something that we learn something from. So this won't be the discussion specifically for resurrection, although what you say when you say that resurrection from the dead proves who God is, absolutely. And that is a powerful testament. All right, let's look at some important passages, and some of these we've already kind of talked about, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on. First of all, the glory of the Lord and the temple. So, once again, chapter 10, what does he do? He leaves, right? Picks up his glory and goes. Starting in chapter 43, what does he do? Yeah, he returns. Rebuild the temple, the city, all of that type of stuff. He returns, and it's going to be even more glorious than it was before. All right, we're not going to talk about these, but these are, I think, important passages. Chapter 16, chapter 23, especially chapter 16. We're not going to talk about these because of certain company that's in the room, because there are definitely places in the Bible that are PG-13 and beyond. And Ezekiel chapter 16 is definitely one of those, in which he talks about very graphically the way that he sees Israel's adultery and how they went to all the other nations and their gods instead of staying faithful to Yahweh. So I think these are important passages for Ezekiel, but like I said, we're not going to go through these right now. In an adult class, this would be worthy of discussion and seeing how he describes all of this. Now, this one I think is worth looking at. Let's turn over to Ezekiel chapter 34. In Ezekiel chapter 34, this is an important chapter concerning the leaders of Israel. And so in this one, he talks about shepherds, the leaders of Israel, and he describes them in different ways. In this chapter, first of all, he describes them as fellow sheep and the way that they are treating the sheep. And then he describes them as shepherds and the way that they should be leading as shepherds. So, chapter 34, starting verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, and say to them, this is what the Lord God says to the shepherds. Woe to the shepherds of Israel, who've been feeding themselves. Shouldn't the shepherds feed their flock? You eat the fat, wear the wool, butcher the fattened animals, but you do not tend the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, healed the sick, bandaged the injured, brought back the strays, or sought the lost. Instead, you have ruled them with violence and cruelty. They were scattered for a lack of a shepherd. They became food for all the wild animals when they were scattered. My flock went astray on all the mountains and every high hill. My flock was scattered over the whole face of the earth, and there was no one searching or seeking them. So, just that little tidbit right there, what is this telling us that shepherds should be doing? Okay, their job, but very specifically. What does this say? Okay. All right, so the shepherds should be feeding them. What else? Okay. Strengthening the weak, healing the sick, bandaging the injured, or whatever your translation says there. Oh, bringing back, is that what's, okay, bringing back the strays and seeking the lost. I'm going straight out of the text right now, Joshua, so go ahead and put your hand down on this one, okay? We're just going straight exactly the very words that Ezekiel has given us. We don't even have to give thought to this, do we? This isn't a think type of question, mull it around and let's see. He is saying directly right here, this is the work of a shepherd. And by shepherd, a leader of God's people. This is the job. This is the job requirements. This is the job duty. This is what they should have been doing. Instead, what happened to the sheep? Yeah, they're scattered. The wild animals are getting to them. They're scattered all the way to what places? The mountains and high hills or high places. What's that referencing? Idolatry. That's a picture of them leaving God in the fold, in the place where God wants them to be, and now they're going out to the place of other gods. And they're scattering out where they would worship these other gods in these other places. Verse 7, therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord as I live. This is the declaration of the Lord God. Because my flock, lacking a shepherd, has become prey and food for every wild animal, because my shepherds do not search for my flock, and because the shepherds feed themselves rather than the flock, therefore hear the word of the Lord. Verse 10, I am against the shepherds. I will demand my flock from them, prevent them from shepherding the flock, and the shepherds will no longer feed themselves, for I will rescue my flock from their mouths, so they will not be food for them. I myself will search for my flock and look for them, as a shepherd looks for his sheep on the day he is scattered. As on the day he is among his scattered flock, so I will look for my flock and rescue them from the places where they've been scattered on a day of clouds and total darkness, and bring them out from the peoples, gather them and bring them to their own soil, and I will shepherd them on the mountains of Israel. So, verse 16, I will seek the lost and bring back the strays, bandage the injured, strengthen the weak, and destroy the fat and the strong. I will shepherd them with justice. And I'm going to judge, verse 17, between one sheep and another, between the ram and the goats. Isn't it enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you trample the rest of the pasture with your feet? Isn't it enough that you drink the clear water? Must you also muddy the rest of the water? Yet my flock has to feed on what you've trampled and drink what you have muddied. So there's a lot of language here about God saying, I'm going to come and do what? What's that, Joshua? Okay, to make God's flock holy, but he has to do what first? Okay, he's going to deal with the shepherds, but he spends more time saying he's going to do what? Go find them, to seek them. He's going to seek the lost. For what purpose? Because they're his flock. They're his flock. He needs to find them and save them from the situation that they're in, right? Verse 22, he says, I will seek my flock. Verse 22, I will what? How does verse 22 begin for you? Keep on going. Okay, I will deliver. I will save. He's going out to seek his flock. He's going to save his flock. And they will no longer be prey. He will judge between one sheep and another. I will establish over them one shepherd, my servant David. He will shepherd them, tend them himself, and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. So who's the shepherd that he's sending? All right, his servant David to do what? Use the words here. What's he doing? He's going to first? No. What? Before saving, what does he have to do? I've been trying to feed you guys these words that I want you to say, and I need you to say the very words. So, he first will what? Find. Give me another word besides find. Seek. He will first seek, and then what? Save the what? The lost sheep. David is going to be sent as a shepherd to seek and save the lost sheep. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Sounds like a song? Yeah. Luke chapter 19, what does Jesus say his whole purpose was?
Seek and save the lost.
For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. To seek and to save the lost, right? How many times do you see these parables? Multiple of the writers give a parable of going after the one, leaving the rest, going after the one, seeking and saving the lost. This is the very picture that Ezekiel is trying to paint here. This is what the shepherd's role, the shepherd's job is. And this is what was so messed up in Jesus' day with the leaders of Israel. I don't think it's just a coincidence that Jesus comes at such a time when the leaders of Israel are doing what? Are they pretty good? Yeah, they're messing it all up. All kinds of problems, all kinds of issues. They're taking care of themselves, but they're messing up the way that they're treating the others. And you go back to verse 2 here, and what does he have to say to the shepherds of Israel? In verse 2, what does he say? Woe to you. You finish the phrase. Woe to you, you. No. Right now, I want you to do a connect the dots. Woe to you, you what, Aaron? Woe to you, you scribes and you Pharisees, you hypocrites. That's Jesus' condemnation, the woes that he places upon the sheep, the shepherds of Israel, the leaders of Israel, who are doing a horrific job messing everything up and putting themselves opposed to God and God's purpose through Jesus. Ezekiel chapter 34 is describing incredibly well the very scenario that the servant David steps into, and he has to seek and to save the lost sheep of Israel because he has compassion on them, as Mark tells us before the feeding of the 5,000. He has compassion on them, for they are like sheep without a shepherd. The shepherds were there, but they weren't shepherding. The sheep were scattered. And so Jesus comes in to seek and to save. By the way, this is an incredible passage to go to see what does shepherd leadership look like when you talk about the leaders of a church who are described with what word? Shepherds, pastors, shepherds. The elders or shepherds of a church, what are they supposed to be doing? This is what they're failing to do that's right in their day and their time, right? But to understand it, this is what you do. And also, as Peter points out, you do this recognizing that even as a shepherd, you also have a what? You have a shepherd who's over you. And that's the kind of mindset for leadership within a church that I think Ezekiel chapter 34 really helps us to understand and see. Does that make sense? These, and hopefully you're seeing these connections into the New Testament and these ideas, especially here. This is very explicit when he mentions David, right? My servant David, because David is long dead at this point. So he's obviously referring to someone to come later. All right, any questions on chapter 34? Okay, well, I'm going to hold them actually because I want to get through. We're not going to talk about this, Gog and Magog. I put this up here simply because it is important, and it is important because people are going to talk about it. And they'll say, oh, this is Gog, and this is, of Magog, and all of that. It's just important to understand this is not a real battle that he's describing. This is not meant to be taken literally. He is creating a caricature of an ideal enemy of God. And this battle is something that kind of plays out throughout time, but it's really all about the victory of the Messiah over the real enemy, the adversary and death. But again, I don't want to spend much time with it. I just wanted to bring it up. And then Ezekiel chapter 36. Ezekiel chapter 36. This is Ezekiel's new covenant text. Just like Jeremiah has Jeremiah 31 through 34, which we have talked about, right? Yeah. This one, starting verse 24, he says, I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the countries, bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. And I will cleanse you from all your impurities and all your idols, and I will give you a new heart. Put a new spirit within you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will place my spirit within you and cause you to follow my statutes and carefully observe my ordinances. So he's talking about a future time in which the heart of stone is going to be removed. And there will be, let's see here, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. I will give you a heart of flesh. If you'll notice, this is very quickly followed by what? Next chapter. All right, the valley of the dry bones. And I think this is part of the picture. What does it mean that he's going to do this? There is, as Joshua mentioned earlier, a resurrection that is going to take place. And it's not talking about literal resurrected people per se, although there's certainly a part of that that could be in this discussion. And, given the time, maybe this will turn into a sermon at some point to go through and talk about the valley of the dry bones. But this is kind of the idea. That is recreating, reimagining Israel and Judah, both of them together. That is being God's people. That they have, at this moment, it seems as if all is lost. Temple's destroyed, Jerusalem's destroyed. God has gotten into his chariot, he's left. This is about as down of a point as you could possibly imagine in Israel's history. But is the story over? No. The story is not finished. As a professor of mine liked to say, judgment is never the end of the story. Judgment just simply is that moment that God kind of reshapes the story and pushes it forward, moving in a different direction. So judgment is never the end of the story. There is always hope remaining. And so with this hope here, he talks about the reunification then of Israel. Again, not a reunification as many people would like to take this, that he's going to put a nation called Israel at a certain point in the land and reestablish the Davidic monarchy there on the throne by putting Jesus on said throne for 1,000 years or whatever the case might be. What he has in mind is what so many of the prophetic writers have in mind when they talk about stuff like that, and that is God connected to his people through Jesus. That is the church. And that we are that reunified form of God's people that's here. As Paul talks about that tree that's rooted in the people of old, and that tree that still continues to grow, that we've been grafted in as Gentiles. We've been grafted into it, but it's still part of the people of Israel who are descended from Abraham by faith. So, all right, we're out of time. And I believe, yes, that is all that we have. Are there any final comments before I turn this over to Richard? So, yeah, Joshua? All right, I'll talk about the Valley of Dry Bones in a sermon at some point, because we need to move on from Ezekiel, and we'll get into that discussion. So, very good observation. And with that, yes. Thanks a lot, guys. Good class. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Richard.